The nearest bed is 240 miles away, and it might not even be open. That is the math a truck driver has to do somewhere north of the Brooks Range, on a gravel highway most Americans have never heard of, where the next building with 4 walls and a roof is not a guarantee. Most people assume a truck stop is always there, lit up, waiting, the same way it waits on an interstate outside Denver or Dallas. In Alaska's Arctic, that assumption can get a driver into real trouble. Here is what actually happens when the workday ends 300 miles from the nearest town, and where exactly a trucker is supposed to close their eyes. Most people picture a truck stop as a permanent fixture. Fuel pumps, a diner, a parking lot the size of a football field, open every day of the year without question. On the Dalton Highway, the road that connects Fairbanks to the oil fields at Prudhoe Bay, that picture falls apart almost immediately. The highway runs about 414 miles on its own, and when you add the stretch of road south of it that connects to Fairbanks, the full haul north comes to roughly 500 miles, almost all of it without a single traffic light, a hospital, or a grocery store. Along that distance, there are only a handful of places where a driver can legally and safely stop, refuel, and rest. Some of them are only open part of the year. A few of them were never meant to be truck stops at all. Drivers built them. This is the part most people never realize. The most famous stop on the entire route, a place called Coldfoot, sits at roughly the halfway point, at mile 175. It did not start as a business. In the early 1980s, a musher who had won the Iditarod set up an old-school bus on the side of the road and started selling hamburgers to the truckers hauling freight up to the pipeline construction camps. The drivers themselves picked up scrap lumber and leftover pipeline insulation crates and started hammering together what eventually became Coldfoot Camp, the truck stop and inn that still serves the highway today. The lodging rooms are converted pipeline-era dormitory units. The restaurant, still called the Truckers Cafe, runs around the clock. There is no town hiding behind it. Coldfoot exists because the people who needed it built it with their own hands, out of whatever materials the pipeline left behind. Coldfoot is small enough that one detail surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. The post office. It operates only 3 afternoons a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And for years, the person stamping the mail worked the counter alongside the bar and the cafe at the same time. In a place this remote, jobs blend together because there simply are not enough people to keep them separate. A trucker mailing a postcard home from above the Arctic Circle is, in a very literal sense, handing it to whoever happens to be staffing that particular counter that particular afternoon. Most people would assume that once you find a place like that, the problem is solved. But here is where the obvious assumption falls apart. North of Coldfoot, the next services do not appear for another 240 miles, all the way to Deadhorse, the industrial community that serves the Prudhoe Bay oil fields. 240 miles without fuel, without a bathroom, without cell service. For most of that stretch, AT&T and GCI offer only scattered, unreliable coverage. And for long sections, there is none at all. If a truck breaks down in that gap, in temperatures that can swing toward minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, the driver cannot simply call for a tow truck the way someone might outside Chicago. This is the first hidden reality of the route. Distance itself is a hazard, independent of weather, independent of mechanical condition. The empty space between stops is part of the danger. So before a driver ever leaves Fairbanks, the planning begins. Carriers that specialize in the haul road, companies like Carlisle Transportation, Linden Transport, and Alaska West Express, do not send a new hire north alone. New drivers typically have to complete a series of supervised trips alongside an experienced driver before they're cleared to run the route independently. And even experienced drivers are often required to convoy together when conditions turn severe, so that if one truck goes down, there is another close behind to help. This is not bureaucracy for its own sake. It is the trucking version of a buddy system used by mountaineers. born from decades of watching what happens when someone tries to handle the Arctic alone. The route itself includes one obstacle that drivers mention more often than any blizzard: Atigun Pass. Sitting at roughly mile 245, it is the highest point on Alaska's entire highway system, climbing to around 4,800 feet through grades that can run 11 to 12%. Steep enough that loaded trucks have to manage both engine braking and traction at the same time, on a surface that is gravel or ice depending on the season. The pass marks the crossing of the Brooks Range itself, and avalanche danger is a real consideration in winter and spring. Not a dramatic exaggeration for television. Drivers who have run the haul road for years still talk about Atigun with a level of respect they do not extend to the open, flat stretches further south, because a mistake on a flat road usually means a slide into a ditch, while a mistake on Atigun can mean a slide with nothing to stop it for a long way down. Once a driver actually reaches one of these remote stops, the next surprise is what waits inside. Most people imagine a truck stop as a place where the trucker is the customer and everyone else works there. At Yukon River Camp, the seasonal outpost at mile 56 where the highway crosses the only bridge over the Yukon River in the entire state, that is only partly true. The camp offers food, fuel, showers, and lodging, but it operates only from roughly mid-May to mid-September. For the other 7 months of the year, when the cold is at its worst and the need is greatest, the camp is simply closed. A driver crossing that bridge in January finds nothing waiting. No coffee, no diesel, no warm room. The only services available become whatever the truck itself can provide, and whatever fuel is already in the tank. There is a detail buried inside that seasonal closure that most viewers miss entirely. Every one of these camps, including the ones built specifically to feed and shelter truck drivers, depends on trucks to exist in the first place. The diesel sold at Coldfoot arrived on a truck. The food served at Deadhorse Camp's buffet arrived on a truck. Even the lumber and plumbing fixtures used to build these outposts came up the same gravel highway the drivers are now stopping to rest on. It is a strange kind of loop. The infrastructure that keeps truckers alive only exists because truckers hauled the materials to build it. And it only stays stocked because trucks keep returning. If the trucks ever stopped running this corridor entirely, the camps themselves would have no way to resupply and would not last a season. Fuel prices along the route reflect exactly how far everything has to travel to get there. Diesel at Coldfoot routinely costs noticeably more than what a driver would pay in Fairbanks, and prices only climb further north. Since every gallon sold at these remote pumps had to be trucked in over hundreds of miles of gravel before it could be sold. Rooms follow the same logic. Lodging in places like the Slate Creek Inn or Deadhorse Camp is priced closer to what someone might expect from a city hotel than from a roadside motel. Not because the accommodations are luxurious, but because heating a rustic room through an Arctic winter and flying or trucking, in every supply needed to keep the building running, is simply expensive, no matter how plain the room looks once you are inside it. This is where the hidden engineering of the truck becomes the real story. Most people assume that if a trucker cannot reach a building, they simply freeze. In reality, the sleeper cab itself is built to function as a survival shelter, and the equipment inside it is the actual subject worth understanding. Carriers running the haul road typically equip their trucks with auxiliary power units, small secondary engines mounted behind the cab that can run the heater and electrical systems without keeping the massive main engine idling all night. An idling semi-engine can burn close to a gallon of diesel every hour. An auxiliary power unit can stretch that same gallon across several hours of heat. For a driver parked at a pullout along the haul road with no services for 100 miles in either direction, that difference is not a comfort upgrade. It can be the difference between having enough fuel to reach the next open stop and not having it. But equipment fails, and this is exactly the unexpected complication every experienced Arctic driver plans for. Auxiliary power units have moving parts, and moving parts break, especially in temperatures that make metal brittle and lubricants thicken. When the auxiliary unit goes down at -30 degrees, the original backup plan returns. Idle the main engine, watch the fuel gauge, and wait for first light or for help to arrive. Drivers on this route describe carrying extra blankets, sleeping bags rated well below freezing, and insulated gear specifically because they know any single heat source on board could fail, and a second method has to exist as a backup to the backup. This layered redundancy, heater, then engine idle, then bedding, then body heat, is the actual hidden knowledge of Arctic trucking. It is not one clever piece of gear. It is a chain of fallback options, each one assuming the last one might not work tonight. Wildlife adds its own layer of unpredictability to a route already short on margin. Moose, caribou, foxes, and the occasional bear move freely across the Dalton corridor. And a moose standing in the roadway at night, invisible until headlights catch it at the last second, has caused more than one serious collision on this highway over the years. Drivers learn to scan the tree line out of habit, the same way drivers further south learn to watch brake lights ahead of them. Out here, the hazard is not traffic. It is the chance that the next curve in the road hides several 100 pounds of animal that has no reason to move out of the way. Even basic plumbing becomes a small miracle of engineering at this latitude. Water lines at remote camps have to be buried deep enough, or heated continuously enough, to avoid freezing solid the moment temperatures drop below zero. And a frozen water line at a place like Deadhorse Camp is not a minor inconvenience fixed by a quick call to a plumber. It can mean no showers and no working toilets for staff and guests alike until the line thaws or is repaired, in a location where replacement parts might be days away by truck. Most travelers who stop at these camps never think about the fact that running water itself, something taken for granted almost everywhere else in the country, has to be actively defended against the climate 24 hours a day, every day of the winter. Most people never realize that even when a driver does reach an open stop, the description truck stop barely applies. At Deadhorse, the northern end of the line, the closest thing to a hotel is a structure built on stilts above the permafrost, designed in a style its own staff describe as consistent with the industrial character of the region. Rooms typically hold 2 narrow beds. Bathrooms and showers sit down a shared hallway, separated by gender, not by room. Guests are often asked to remove their shoes at the door to keep gravel dust out of the hallways. The buildings exist primarily to house oil field workers rotating through 2- and 3-week shifts, and truckers are folded into that same system, eating the same buffet-style meals in the same dining hall, sleeping under the same roof as engineers and laborers who came up from every part of the country to work 12- and 14-hour shifts in one of the harshest labor environments in North America. There is no hotel lobby, no separate trucker's lounge. The driver becomes, for one night, part of an industrial labor camp that has nothing to do with hospitality and everything to do with keeping a remote, hostile patch of land functional. This is the detail most outsiders find hardest to picture. A long-haul trucker delivering freight to the top of the continent does not check into a Marriott with a parking lot for trucks. They check into the same camp-style bunk system used by the oil rig crews, eat the same cafeteria food at the same long tables, and trade stories with workers from completely different professions who happen to be stuck in the same remote outpost for the same reason. There's simply nowhere else to be. Drivers describe these dining halls as one of the only places on the entire route where conversation flows freely, where the isolation of the previous several hundred miles briefly lifts, before the next morning's departure puts them back behind the wheel and back into silence. And silence is its own challenge. Between these scattered camps, drivers spend their mandated rest periods inside the cab itself, parked in company yards at Prudhoe Bay, or in pullouts scattered along the highway, well outside cell coverage, with nothing but the dashboard lights and the hum of the heater for company. Federal hours of service rules require a set period of rest before a driver can return to the wheel, and electronic logging devices track that rest automatically, recording exactly when the truck stopped moving and when the engine restarted. There is no flexibility to push through fatigue. Here, the way there might be on a busy interstate with constant truck stops every 50 miles. Out here, the rule itself becomes a kind of forced mercy, guaranteeing rest in an environment that otherwise offers none. But it also means a driver cannot simply decide to push on toward the next open camp if their hours run out first. They stop wherever they happen to be, in whatever weather happens to be happening, and they wait out the clock. What ties all of this together? The converted bus that became a cafe, the bridge camp that vanishes every winter, the labor camp that doubles as a hotel, the engine that has to outlast the auxiliary heater, is a single uncomfortable truth that most people watching trucks roll by on an ordinary highway never have to consider. Infrastructure out here was never designed around comfort. It was built, piece by piece, by people solving an immediate problem with whatever materials were on hand. The same way Coldfoot itself began with a school bus and a folding grill. Every stop along this route exists because someone needed it badly enough to build it, not because a corporation calculated foot traffic and decided the location made financial sense. That is the difference between a truck stop in the lower 48 and an outpost on the haul road. One is a business decision. The other is closer to a survival pact between drivers, going back generations. What makes this route different from the blizzards and whiteouts already covered on this channel is not the cold itself, but the absence of options once the cold sets in. A driver caught in a sudden storm somewhere outside Minneapolis can usually find 5 truck stops within an hour's drive. A driver caught the same way north of Coldfoot may have one option 200 miles away, and that option might be closed for the season. This forces a completely different kind of decision-making, one built not around finding the best stop, but around making sure you never run out of road before you run out of options. Veteran haul road drivers plan their entire day, sometimes their entire week, around the location of the next confirmed open facility, treating fuel levels and rest hours less like routine bookkeeping and more like the only insurance policy available out here. There is a particular kind of pride that comes from doing this work well, and it surfaces in the way experienced drivers talk about the route. They speak of looking out for each other on the CB radio, warning oncoming trucks about ice patches or stranded vehicles, slowing down and pulling slightly to the side when meeting another rig, so a chunk of flying gravel does not crack a windshield. They speak of pulling over to help a stranger from a competing company without a second thought, because out here, the competition that exists between trucking companies in the lower 48 simply does not apply. Everyone on this road depends on everyone else making it through in one piece. The isolation that defines the haul road is also, paradoxically, what creates one of the tightest informal support networks in American trucking. Nobody out here is really a stranger for long. By the time a driver reaches the end of a run, whether that is the warmth of Deadhorse Camp's dining hall after 500 miles of gravel and silence, or simply the relief of pulling into Coldfoot to find the lights still on, something has shifted in how they think about the job. The truck was never really the point. The roof over their head every night, the cab itself when nothing else is available, becomes something closer to a second home that has to function in conditions most houses were never built to survive. The people who keep freight moving across this stretch of Alaska are not chasing adventure. They are making sure fuel, food, equipment, and supplies reach a part of the country that cannot function without them, often while the rest of the world has no idea this road, or the camps strung along it like beads, even exist. The next time a documentary or a photograph shows a truck disappearing into the Arctic distance, it is worth remembering what is actually happening just outside the frame. A driver doing mental math about miles, fuel, and whether the next building down the road is even open this time of year. That quiet calculation, repeated every single day on one of the most remote commercial routes in North America, is the real story behind the headlights. But cold and distance are only one kind of danger truckers face on the road. There is another season, in a completely different part of the country, when the threat does not come from the highway disappearing under snow, but from the air itself turning against them, and the route ahead filling with smoke faster than anyone can plan